Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. We're going to cover a very interesting and important topic, CE marking under machinery directives. And we have our very own Salil Yeragi to cover the topic as a speaker today. Salil, thank you so much for being with us today. Before we actually begin the introduction and move forward, I just wanted to cover a couple of important hygiene points. First, we will be sharing the recording of this webinar today. Everybody who has registered for the webinar will receive a recording within a week of the webinar's completion. Second, any questions that you have during the webinar, please do not wait till the end. Any questions that you have, you can keep sending to us in the chat window. There's a chat box. Please keep sending to us via chat your questions, and we'll have a dedicated question answer round at the end of the presentation. Third, there'll be a very short survey popping up right after the webinar ends. Request you to please fill it in so that we also get an idea of what the industry wants to hear from us next. And lastly, as already mentioned, all the webinar attendees for today will receive a participation certificate from LRQA after the webinar ends. So yeah, moving on to introduction for our today's speaker. Salil has been with us for almost 6 years, and he's a consultant with LRQA Mumbai, India office. With a decade plus of experience, he's the product head for Certificate of Origin and a core member of the Hydrogen Working Group. Since 2016, he has also been consulting on machinery directives, and having spent close to 12 years of experience in this industry, the TIC industry, he has assumed various roles in his career journey so far, including inspection engineer, business development, sales, customer experience, and now ultimately as a consultant with us. So again, welcome to the webinar today, Salil, and thank you so much for being the speaker. Really appreciate it. Over to you.
Thanks, Pallavi. And hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, based on the places that you are attending the webinar. So briefly, I'll introduce what would be the agenda and how we would be going across with the webinar. So initially, we'll start with basically what is CE marking. I'll touch a small base on what is CE marking, and then we'll slowly move on to Machinery Directive, and then what are the 8 generalized steps that are required for complying to Machinery Directive under CE marking. Yeah. So, as I said, let's begin with the introduction of CE marking. So basically, CE marking was this is basically a marking required for products in the European Union. So in 1957, there was a Treaty of Rome wherein 6 countries came together and they signed an treaty stating that there are a few problems which were identified. Was that each state or each country which was there had their own regulation, their own requirement of standards, own requirement of compliance, due to which there was 2 major reasons which were happening is for the trade, wherein a lot of people had to comply to different standards or different regulations or different laws for product export from one country to another country. So the agreement was in the old approach, which was drawn upon that basically it was given by the government of the country, but later on, once the EU had completely formed, everybody came together. They decided, okay, there should be a single approach for the similar products, and to keep the trade easy and to comply to certain standards, they decided to have a CE marking or a CE directives, for example. So normally the directives are aimed at member states, but the member states are obliged to implement the directives into their national legislation. So once that is done, the CE marking can be approached upon accordingly. So the next point is where CE directives are applicable. So CE directives are applicable for new products that fall within the scope of a directive, for an imported product from outside the EU, from the moment that products are placed on the market and when the product is modified. Now, any product which is not falling under the scope of directive does not require a CE marking. There's another important point out over here is even a second-hand product which is from any other country being placed into the European market for the first time will require a CE certification. So coming back to this point, so currently the European Union comprises of around 27 countries. Uh, these are the list of countries that are there and where CE marking would be applicable. Uh, just to highlight, Turkey is not a part of the European Union but has adopted the product directives. And in addition, Turkey is a part of custom union of EU. So there is also a free trade movement of products between EU and Turkey. Um, with Brexit, of course, UK still follows the same framework, but after exit, there was a UCAS marking required and UK declaration of conformity involving UK authority bodies were required. But currently, under the pressure of the transition period, there is no fixed date of when this UCAS marking will be applicable. So, I'm talking about machinery directive out over there, and on based on that, it is still acceptable in the UK market if you're following the processes for CE marking. So what are different CE directives? So as we are into testing, inspection, and certification business, so I've highlighted on the right hand side the most applicable directives that are would be applicable to our industry. So first is the machinery directive, then we have CPR, then we have electromagnetic compatibility, then ATEX, low voltage directive, pressure equipment directive. So these are basically the few directives which you would have, or which your products would require. But on the other hand, there are a lot of different things. There are a lot of different directives in place. So which I have highlighted on the right hand side, but which might be applicable to some of our people out there on onto this webinar. But here for today, we'll only be concentrating on machinery directive, and I'll take you through that aspect of the directive. So machinery directive was first introduced, in I think 31st December 1992. There have been approximately 3 amendments as of now, and all the 3 amendments, if you see, the there are certain changes into it, but the basis of the initial directive, which was you know uh, which came into place in 1992, has the same essence. So basically, there are no radical changes, but just to highlight, the main changes were some scope extensions, like construction site host and cartridge operated fixing impact machinery was no longer excluded. There was a borderline between machinery directive and low voltage directive, which was clarified. Distinction is no longer made based on main risk. Instead, now machinery directive lists 6 categories that are borderline with lifts. Directive has been clarified. Lifts speed greater than 0.15 meters per second now fall under machinery directive. So there were slight changes onto all these things, but the basics remains the same. So here, what we'll go through is the 8 steps that are required for machinery directive. And so it is first we'll move to the scope of directive, then the responsibility for CE marking, conformity assessment, information, compliance to your technical file. Is there a requirement for notified body? Then EC declaration of conformity, and finally CE marking. So based on what we have discussed, this is a question for the entire audience. Is what do you feel? This looking at this diagram, uh, will this fall under machinery directive, or there are any other directive that we should consider into this? You can put your answers. I'll give you a 30 seconds time, and maybe you can put your answers into chat box. Nobody's. Okay, fine. So I'm so sorry, I can't see the answers right now, but yeah. So for those of you who have answered, thank you so much. Basically, for this particular product, it will fall under machinery directive because there might be moving parts with external power source. It will fall under low voltage directive, electromagnetic compatibility as well, and ATEX if it is falling under a hazardous zone. So as I was stating, machinery directive always will be with a combination of other directives. So that was one of the example which I wanted to share with you. So moving back to the first point, what is the scope of directive? So basically in machinery directive, they have defined machinery as assembly consisting of linked part or component, at least one of which moves, fitted with or intended to be fitted with a drive system, joined together for a specific application, interchangeable equipment, safety components, and lifting equipments. So moving on to the first point, where the parts are not linked, it is not considered as machinery. Where parts are supplied, disassembled, for instance, for transportation or storage purpose, the machinery must be designed and constructed so that the errors fitting during the assembly are avoided. Products without moving parts are not considered in machinery. Moving parts are powered by driven system, whether it be thermal, electrical, pneumatic, hydraulic, or mechanical energy will fall under machinery directive. Typical applications, for instance, is processing, treatment, packaging, moving of material objects or person. Components that are intended to be incorporated into machinery but yet do not have a specific purpose. For example, ball bearings, pulleys, hydraulic cylinders do not themselves have to adhere to machinery directive, but when they are used in assembly, the complete machine must adhere to it. So these are a few examples of what kind of products will fall under a machinery directive. So yeah, in order for there to be an assembly, the constituent units are assembled together in order to carry out a common function. For example, the production of given product. The constituent units are functionally linked in such a way that the operation of each unit directly affects the operation of other units or the assembly as a whole, so that risk assessment is necessary for the whole assembly. The third is the constituent units have a common control system. So again, this is clause 38, which I would like to bring to your notice is assembly does not extend to complete industrial plant. Even if controlled by a single production control system, it will fall under machinery directive. So most industrial plants can be divided into different sections. Even a single production line can be divided into separate assembly if there is no safety related connections. Who is responsible for the assembly? The person constituting an assembly of machinery is considered as the manufacturer of the assembly or of the machinery and is responsible for ensuring that the assembly as whole complies with the health and safety requirement of machinery directive. Assembly of machinery are subject to machinery directive because their safety depends not just on the safety design and construction of the constituent units, but also on the suitability of the units and the interface between them. The risk assessment for such products to be carried out by the manufacturer of an assembly of the machinery must therefore cover both the suitability of the constituent units for the safety of the assembly as well as the whole and the hazardous results from the interface between the constituent units. It must also cover any hazards resulting from assembly that are not covered by EC declaration of conformity for machinery or declaration of incorporation and assembly instruction for partly completed machinery supplied by the manufacturer of constituent units. Now, I know this is something, but we'll get deep down into what is EC declaration of conformity, what is partly completed machinery, so which are based on the next slides. So what are the duties of manufacturer of the assembly? Carry out a conformity assessment procedure for the assembly, affix a CE marking to the assembly, including a CE mark, draw up and sign EC declaration of conformity, and compile a technical file which must contain the risk assessment and design details of the interface between the items. So here, right now on this particular slide, Can you tell me which kind of directives would be applicable, and do you think this should come under Machinery Directive? I'll give you 30 seconds to answer. Okay. So yeah, I've seen a lot of answers. Yes, correct. This would fall under a Machinery Directive, but over and above that, it will fall under PD. It will fall under uh, EMC Directive. As far as I've seen this product, so it was also falling under ATEX as well. So as I said, all this three or four directives will combine together for this assembly to be certified under CE marking. So yeah, again, Machinery Directive, then this is clause 39 of the guidance document. I missed to tell you in the first instance that Machinery Directive is more of a guidance document. So interpretation of it is not always the same. It depends upon the individual. But at the end of the day, whichever interpretation is more suitable for defining it under Machinery Directive and its requirement is what we need to follow. Okay. So basically here risk assessment shows that the replacement or addition into an existing assembly does not add a new hazard nor increase the risk. No action is required for the parts that are not affected by the modification. If there is a new hazard or increase of risk, but existing protective measures are still sufficient, no further actions are required. The employer or the manufacturer must ensure that the Directive 2019-104 EC is followed. In addition, has a substantial impact on the operation or safety or involves substantial modification of the assembly, it may be considered that a modification amount to the constitution of a new assembly. In case the whole assembly, including all the units, must comply with the provision of the Machinery Directive. So this is the interchangeable equipment and the changes function wherein Machinery Directive will fall under. So for example, platforms to be assembled with lifting machinery for the purpose of lifting person are interchangeable equipment, but they fall under the Annexure 4, meaning that here it will require a notified body's approval. So there are different annexures in place. So some of the Annexure 4, or if it is related to safety components, then a notified body involvement is required. But we'll slowly move on to that as well. So the scope of directive, which also, as I said, has included lifting accessories and partly completed machinery. So who is the responsible party right now for having the CE marking under Machinery Directive? So manufacturer, legal responsible party, design and construction, also for own use, assembler, importer, or a modifying party. Now, for manufacturer, design and construction is often done by different party. The party who is best able to make sure that the fundamental safety requirement, example, who controls the design and construction process are met, is considered to be the manufacturer. When subcontracting design and construction, the party who assumes legal responsibility, who has, the person who's going to place it on the market must ensure control over his suppliers. Also, when manufacturing of own use, the user is seen as manufacturer and must fulfill all obligation. Assembly, one party must assume responsibility for the conformity of assessment or the assembly as a whole. This can be the manufacturer of one of the parts, a contractor, or a user. Importer, when it is not ensured that the manufacturer outside the EU fulfills all this obligation, the party placing the machinery on the market is held responsible, whether it is to be safe for sale or for its own use. Modification. If modification was not foreseen or agreed by the manufacturer, the original CE marking becomes invalid and has to be renewed. The modifier is to be considered as the manufacturer in this case. Modification needs to be substantial, change of function and or performance of the machinery, then they have to again apply for a machinery directive uh, declaration. Now conformity assessment. So risk related to moving parts. So Annexure 1 of every directive contains the so-called essential safety requirements. These are, or what we have to be fulfilled in the end. It does not state how the requirements can be fulfilled, but only what the result should be. Technical guidance as how to fulfill these requirements is given in the harmonized standards. There is a link which I'll share across in the chat box as well in a later part, which allows you to identify the harmonized standard which are as per the product requirement. In some cases, risk assessment will be needed to be carried out as a part of conformity assessment. In case of machinery, a checklist method, ATEX ignition assessment, there are different ways in which risk can be identified for moving parts. So it's there into the presentation, but I'll share it across with you as well. Yeah. So conformity assessment. So there are types of harmonized standard. Type A, which is general safety principle. Then B1 type, standardized safety aspect. B2 safety devices. C type is specific machinery. Then A is basically dependent on EN ISO 12100, safety of machinery risk assessment and principle. B1 is based on ISO 13857, safety of machinery, safety distance to prevent the hazard zones being reached by the upper or lower limits. B2 is EN 574, two hand control devices, and C is EN 474 for earth moving equipments. But I would also like to update that as a manufacturer is obliged to follow the contents of the harmonized standard. However, there is very important advantages in doing so. See, as I said, no, it's not obligatory, but why does it help is that when using the standards to meet the essential requirements gives so-called presumption of conformity or even conformity with the standard, the latter being in the case of voluntary certification by a notified body. If the manufacturer decides not to follow the standard, he has to prove conformity to the essential requirements by other means, example, other technical specification, and show that the same level of safety is being provided as per the standard given. So this is another option as well in which we can work across. Oh, these are the standards as I said, 13894 safety of machinery, safety related to parts. So it is divided by subpart, then main designator, then international standard, European harmonized standard, and British standard. So basically, whichever standards you have been utilizing, first you need to identify those standards. And if those standards are with compliance with European harmonized standard, because we are talking about C or other standards which are globally accepted, and we can show that, okay, these standards have been applied, the product design and production has been done according to this standard. Accordingly, we can showcase that the safety of this devices or this machinery has been complied to based on this harmonized standard. And according to that, you can issue your declaration of conformity or incorporation of conformity. So basically, how do we carry out the risk assessment? So there are different methods like checklist methodology, HAZOP, what if, uh, FEMA, Ishikawa diagram, task analysis, fault tree analysis. For most of the machineries, a checklist method is quite sufficient to identify the hazard. One of the most common checklist method would be to use EN ISO 1421-1, which is safety of machinery and risk assessment, and generate a checklist from the hazards identified in this document. A hazard and a HAZOP study, in short, a hazard and operational study, is a systematic technique for identifying hazards and operability problems throughout an entire facility. It is particularly useful to identify unwanted hazards designed into facilities due to lack of information, or introduction into existing facility due to change in process conditions or operating procedures. The objective of HAZOP study are to detect any predictable deviation, undesirable event in such case in process or a system. This purpose is achieved by a systematic study of the operation in each process. Divide system into functional blocks, guide words formulated, example, too much, too little, too high. These are laid against most of the parameters like temperature, pressure, concentration, etc. What if method is again a simple method only useful in non-complex situation. Typically a brainstorming session with a group of experts asking open questions should suffice and get the answers done for it. Failure mode and effective analysis is used basically in automotive and aeronautical branches, but also useful in process industry. Here the installations are divided into sections. Per section, components that can fail are identified and what the consequences would be. However, this method does not take into account the interaction of failing component. It is, however, useful in the design phase to identify alternative component at an early stage. Ishikawa method is to help structure risk analysis again through brainstorming. Starting point is specific hazard, and then factors that can influence that risk are identified. Task analysis is another method in which tasks are aimed at the task and then the operator of the machinery performs. So these are a few one. The negative side of task method is that it is aimed at normal operations only and does not open creative thinking and about potential abnormal situations. Fault tree analysis is again analysis of dangerous situation that has already occurred, either caused by human or component failure. So as I said, a lot of times we use 12100 safety for machinery risk assessment. So these are a few example of what is the origin, what can be the consequences. So of, like for example, a kinetic energy being run over, angular parts being thrown, approach of moving elements to a fixed part, crushing, cutting parts, cutting overseas. So these are the origins that this is a very extensive list, and based on each aspect of the origin, there should be a consequences. Then the consequences in the later side, we'll see how and what to what methodology you have to rate the risk. Again, same one like electric hazards, thermal hazards, noise hazards, vibrational hazards. So these are a few of this hazards in according to 1210 which we identify. So yeah, now coming back to the most important point, risk estimation. So risk estimation is basically one second, give me a minute. Sorry, done on three major aspects. So what is the severity of it, what is the exposure of it, what is the occurrence of it, and how we could avoid it. um, this combined together can get you into a risk graph, or which will tell you what is the level of risk which should be uh, which occurs due to all these things. So here is an example. I wouldn't say like, but you can select your own options and you can put it under what severity you should consider for this, what exposure you need to consider for this, what occurrence you need to consider for this, and the avoidance. Okay, so I'll just read it to you and then I'll go back to the next slide so that you can select the numbers which I have highlighted. So due to an unforeseen design error, an operator was able to open the guard shown in the photo without the use of a tool. The screw holding the guard in place were mostly likely removed for standard maintenance, but were not replaced by maintenance personnel. While trying to remove some residual product built up, which happens about once every shift, the operator got his hand caught in the conveyor pulley, which resulted in injury needing hospital treatment and recovery from injury. So now here, I'll just move back to the next slide. So you have to select the severity for it, which is either 1, 2, or 3, exposure, then occurrence and avoidance. So I'll give you another 40 seconds so that you can select all those 3 things, 4 things, and let us know. So I see a lot of people have posted this thing, so I was just having a quick look, but this was one of the examples where we had worked. And so as I said, it depends upon as it is a guidance document, but the most selected or the completion where we did this was the severity we had considered 2, exposure considered as 2, occurrence 2, and avoidance 1. So basically, according to the graph, it came out to be around a risk of 7. So after like during the question and answer session, we'll show you how this works. It's a uh, we have developed our own file wherein you have to put for each thing and then it highlights it. But during Q&A, I can show you that example as well. Now, the next point is risk evaluation and risk reduction, 3-step method. So first is eliminate the hazard or reduce the risk by design, that is at the source. Reduce the risk by safeguarding and other protective measures and information of use. So safeguarding according to ISO 14120, which is generally required for design and construction of fixed and movable guards, and IC 61508 functional safety for electrical and electromagnetic or programmable electronic safety related systems. So here, you know, what I would like to inform, like for this thing, the information, warning, and instruction about residual risk concerns the 3rd step or 3-step method on principles of safety integration. The fact that this is 3rd step is last in order of priority implies that warning and instructions must not be substitute for inherent safety design measures. And proactive measures, preferably information on machinery, should be in form of readably understood symbols or pictogram. When information is written in words, example monitor screen, it must be given in the language of the member state in which the machinery is placed on the market. The user may request the information in any other language of the EU that is understood by the operators. Manufacturer's instruction must accompany the machinery. All health safety instruction must be supplied in paper form. However, it may be useful for the instructions to be made available also in electronic form to replace the paper, and with the digitization going on. Instruction must cover not only intended use of the machinery, but also take into account reasonably foreseeable misuse thereof. EN 62079 gives some guidelines on structuring content and the presentation of the instruction, not only for the operator of machinery, but also for transport, installation, testing, maintenance, cleaning, etc. For all this risk reduction methodology should be applied. Location of workstation, adjustment of seats or other parts of machinery in order to ensure good ergonomical posture, layout and identification of control device and their functions, use of guards and protective devices, use of equipments to contain or evacuate hazardous substance. All these things should be a part of the risk reduction policy, and similarly it should be applied as well. So one of the example is the use of additional screen on guards in the workplace, the organization of safety system of work, the restriction of certain tasks wherein training and authorization of the operators is required needs to be completed, and accordingly to mitigate the risk should be applied while getting or while working into machinery directive CE marking. Risk reduction, again, I'm not sure, but are people aware about ALAP? But I'll just, it's a huge topic if I go into it, but basically it says that zero risk can never be achieved. Non-tolerable risk must be reduced. Further reduction of risk would lead to grossly disappropriate cost with regards to the resulting benefit. So here is ALAP. So there are certain risks which are intolerable. Risk cannot be justified except it is in extraordinary circumstances. And ALAP or tolerable region, this is a region to which only tolerable only if further risk reduction that is for its cost and disproportionate to the improved gain. And and the last one is broadly accepted region, which is negligible risk. Information of the warning instructions section summarizes information of manufacture and design of machinery description. So this is basically what information you need to put across for your or when you're complying or trying to comply to the product through Machinery Directive. So basically the information of from which manufacturer it is coming, a designation of machinery, description of the machinery for which it is intended to be used, the drawings, diagrams, description necessary for use, description of workstation, information about residual risk, noise emissions, all these things need to be considered. Now the next and the most important point is where we are on step 5 is complying the technical file. Now technical file is more like a dossier when we complete some equipment or a product, wherein we need to supply general description of the machinery, the overall drawing of the machinery and drawings of the control circuits, full detailed drawings, calculation note, test results, certificates, documentation on risk assessment, list of essential health and safety requirement, description of protective measures to reduce the risk, standards and other technical specifications used for that particular product, and technical reports giving the test results carried out. A copy of the instruction, this is the continuation of it. Instruction of the machinery, declaration of incorporation, declaration of conformity of products incorporated, declaration of conformity again, like it's, I think it has repeated, and for series manufacturer internal production control measures. There is, this is the most important point, is that a technical file, when you're supplying it to the EU, should be with the manufacturer as well as or the responsible person or with the local representative. I'll come back to that point as well, for at least 10 years. So it is mandatory according to the regulation that the technical file should be saved for 10 years. Again, coming to the technical file must demonstrate that a machinery complies with the requirements of directive. It must cover design, manufacture, and operation of the machinery. Technical file here must be officially in the language of EU. This is often language of the manufacturer, although he may also include information on sub-assemblies or components in another language. Document written in non-EU language must be translated. However, it is not essential that all documents should be permanently available in material form, but it must be possible to make available on request. It is intended, not included, detailed plans of sub-assemblies used for the manufacturer of machinery, unless knowledge of such plan is essential in order to ascertain conformity with the essential health and safety requirements. So whatever is your risk assessment, your test reports, your drawings, these are key factors for a technical file, and this should be with the manufacturer. But basically right now what has happened, especially I'm not sure if it is in this slide, but a technical file should be with a local representative. Now what is a local representative? And a lot of people, this has been incorporated for a very long time, but when we see a lot of declarations, we find that there are people are missing onto it. So a local representative is something that you need to have a legal entity. It can be a company, it can be a person, but who acts on your behalf, and he should be situated in EU countries, wherein if something goes wrong, the first point of contact for that particular instance where the EU authorities will contact him. So now it has become mandatory to have a local representative in your machinery directive declaration or incorporation as well. So I'll show you the examples in the later slide, but this is a key point which I wanted to highlight, that anyone who is supplying from any other countries outside EU, you'll need a legal entity or a legal person to act as a local representative, and he has to also comply that he has the technical file for 10 years. So where is notified bodies requirement? So in many cases for machinery directive, self declaration or self clarification is applicable, but a lot of, as I said, in for as it is combined with low voltage directive or EMC directive. So wherever, as per that directive, if there is a requirement, then a notified body is required for that particular directive, but not for machinery directive. In some cases, for machinery directive, there are, like as I said in Annexure 4, for safety devices or some other devices, there might be a requirement of notified body, but that has to be decided on case-to-case basis, because in this webinar, I'm not sure I'm generalizing the product, but basically any safety component, or like a safety valve or something like that, would require a requirement of notified body, even for machinery directive. Um, for example, as I said, annexure, circular saws, press off for cold working of metal, manual load garbage truck with compression mechanism, devices for lifting person with hazard of falling more than 3 meter, logical unit with safety functions. So these are a few generalized examples where notified body involvement would be there, and there are then modules about type examination and full quality assurance. Now, what is declaration? Like once we have completed all these things, then we move across to a declaration of conformity. Now, 2A is a part of a type of declaration wherein it looks like what are the requirements when you're putting it under 2A, which is for uh, the name and the address of manufacturer, which is the first thing. Name and address of the person who complies to the, as I said, the local representative. Description of machinery, like the function, the model, the type, the serial number, separate sentences declaring conformity with each directive. As I said, it can be a mixture of directive where appropriate notified body number identification is required and against which harmonized standard you have been declaring this. So these are a few things which is required. 1 second, sorry. So here I'll ask you a few questions out over here now. So this is a declaration of conformity, as I stated in the previous slide. I'll just go back. So there is name and address of the manufacturer, name and address of the person who complies to the technical file, description of machinery, function, model, type, serial number, separate sentences declaring conformity with each directive, where appropriate, the notified body's identification number and harmonized standard. So this is a 2A declaration. I'm just giving you an example of 2A declaration, and I'll give you a minute for this because I would request you to have a look at it and then uh, put forward your question. Is this a correct declaration? Or if not, then what are the errors into this declaration? Okay, so I was able to see a few things that a lot of people have said the name and address is missing, which is completely correct. Over and above that, I'll just highlight a few of the mistakes in this declaration. See here, the Machinery Directive 9837/EC has been replaced by 2006-42. There is there's no ATEX mentioned. There's no notified body name out over here, and the new declaration states old ATEX. Low voltage directive 7323 CC has been replaced. Uh, Again, there is no signature. The functionality of the product is not very clear at which date it was given. It is not dated. You can't find a local representative out over here. So these are a few of the things when you are complying with machinery directive, harmonized standards out over here according to which they have complied to written. And I can go into a lot of details, but I think we are running out of time. So I'll highlight the major ones. So this is what are the errors in this declaration. Now, to-be declaration is description. Again, it is for partially completed machine. A description which essentially requires a fulfill obligation to provide health and safety information. Partially completed machine may not be put into use until the final machinery is in conformity. So the first one which we saw was for a fully completed machine, but here this is to-be declaration, which is for partially completed machine, by which you can send it to the European Union, you can place it into the market, but unless and until it is used for a final machinery, it you need a declaration of conformity. Last step is how does a CE marking look like? So and how to fix the CE marking. So basically, it is CE marking which 5 mm can be waived for small products. Example, electrical component. CE marking can take different forms: colors, solid, hollow. It is not allowed to place the CE marking on products that are not subject to CE marking. This is very important. There may be other marking as well, as long as they are not confusing the purpose of CE marking. So as you can see, and this should be based on a nameplate, or it should be visible, or it should be fixed, and it should be a permanent thing which can be identified. Wherever there is an involvement of notified body, as I said, for machinery directive, mostly it is self-declaration. It can be 2A, 2B, but wherein it is required, where a notified body needs to come and carry out this, then of course with a CE marking, you need to have a notified body number. So just what is going to happen in future is the new directive will come into force from 20th January 2027. So what we can expect or see the changes, it will be a regulation instead of a directive. Paperless instructions will be there. There will be substantial modification into what kind of products fall under machinery directive. Self-certification for annexure 4 products, they are looking into that as well. um, Self-learning machinery needs NOBO approval. It's what has been mentioned out there. Cyber security for control systems. Uh, what are the clause? What kind of risk of cyber security needs to be considered into your risk assessment? That has been taken forward. And additional requirements for mobile machinery and development of new guidance documentation. So this is another 3 years ahead, but this will come into force. So currently, as of now, these are a few major aspects of the new machinery directive and what changes to envisage, into this coming years. Yeah, yeah, and I think now we can move ahead with question and answers. Uh, so,
Thank you, Savi. Thank you so much for that session. I think it went great, and at least I learned a lot about CE marking. And going by the number of questions we've been receiving, I'm sure our audience is also equally excited. So yeah, let's get into the questions. The first is, if the individual components meet the requirements of several directives, then the system can be called as CE marked, or we have to fulfill requirements separately. Yeah. So the question says that if the individual components meet the requirements of several directives, then the system can be called as CE marked, or do we have to fulfill the requirements separately for the entire system?
Particularly, it depends upon
Particularly, it depends upon which directive it is falling under and what kind of applicable directives we are putting out on there. And if that is fine and that complies to the requirement of that particular product, then it is fine. And if you're, in other words, if it's an assembly, then uh, whatever as an assembly, as a final product, whatever directives would be applicable needs to be complied as a separate for that assembly. Chris, any your thoughts on that?
Hi, Salil. Thanks, everyone. My name is, just to introduce myself briefly. I'm Chris Pluim. I'm Salil's counterpart. I work from Europe, so I take care of CE marking Machinery Directive in Europe, where Salil is focused more on the Asian market. As to this question, I would say indeed, if individual components, or let's say individual machines, because we're talking about Machinery Directive, if each of these is CE marked, and we assemble them together, it doesn't mean that the new assembly is automatically CE marked as well, because putting things together, you will need to look at the interfaces between them. So I would say that if you're building an assembly or putting components together to build a machine, you would need to look at the complete machine to ensure that the safety requirements are met for the assembly as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. I think that was quite clear. So thanks for your input there. Okay, the next question says, what is the difference between ATEX and PED? ATEX and PED.
Chris, should I go for this question?
No, please go ahead.
So ATEX is one of the directive which is of atmospheric hazardous zone, and PED stands for pressure equipment directive. So these are two different directives altogether.
And it does mean that both directives can be applicable to the same product. If you have let's say a pressure assembly with some moving parts in it, these could cause ignition in a hazardous environment, so they would need to comply with both PED and ATEX. But they are separate, they have a different scope of applicability.
Thank you both. Thank you so much. Moving on to our next question, it says, what is the significance of using EC and EU? When and where it should be used? What is the correct way to mention? I'll repeat, what is the significance of using EC and EU? When and where it should be used? What is the correct way to mention?
The EC is basically, it's an older term, it's European Community. And nowadays, for change the name here in Europe, it's now the European Union. So these EC, European Community, EU, European Union, which means that directives which are published since the name change, European Union, are, you will see EU behind the numbering, and the older directives would still have EC behind the number. So it's just basically an update in the name of the European Union.
Thank you, Chris. We have an interesting question here. It says, if we are making a change or replacement, do we need to inform NOBO? If yes, how?
This is under Machinery Directive?
Yes.
Definitely. If you're modifying it to a certain, as I said, in the initial slides, depending upon the level of modification, and due to that modification, what is the change in the applicability of the equipment? So based on that, you need to consult with the NOBO.
Thank you, Salil. Okay, another one. It says, for a package, if we are assembling few components on site, then for the entire system, how do we do the certification for the entire package?
So for the entire package here, it depends who is the legal owner. Is it the manufacturer or is it the end user? So depending upon that, and if you're manufacturing, if your scope is limited to just supplying the equipments or the assembly components of the assembly, so depending upon machinery directive, you have to get that assembly certified or declared under machinery directive. And once, so I think if it is an assembly and component of it, it will be partially completed machine. And then once it goes into that actual assembly, which is a final machine, then it can have its own declaration as a complete assembly.
Thank you, Salil. We are going to take the last three questions since we are running out of time. Um, which assessment can be used for hydrogen generation system?
Hydrogen, okay, this is nothing related to machinery directive, but hydrogen assessment system, I think you have to go across with a lot of different things like HAZOP, Hazard, QRA, NFPA clauses, then the local government standards, norms. There are different things in hydrogen. So I don't think uh, this is related to machinery directive, but I tried and answered on that point.
Thank you, Salil. Okay. Uh, are there any conformity assessment procedures like in PED?
Chris, I think you should take this.
Yeah, every directive has a conformity assessment procedure, but it can differ from one directive to the other. So with for instance, a low voltage directive, we would basically follow harmonized standards and self-certify the product. In some cases, like with EMC, you would try and do laboratory testing. With PD, you would have a design appraisal and an inspection of the unit. And with machinery directive, it's basically doing the risk assessment, which, as Salil explained, is mostly the checklist method. So that's one part of the conformity assessment, and the other part is verifying compliance with the essential safety requirements of the directive. So every directive has a bit of a different conformity assessment procedure, but in case of machinery, risk assessment and essential safety requirements.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. Okay, our last question for the day. I am purchasing a pump and the manufacturer mentions there is no NOBO involvement and still the pump is CE marked under Machinery Directive. What circumstances is NOBO excluded here? And is this a correct statement from the manufacturer?
Chris?
Yeah. But the fact is actually that with Machinery Directive, and pumps are in scope of Machinery Directive, but there's a list of products which require notified body involvement. And that list is in Annex 4 of the Machinery Directive. It's very limited. So you have machines like bandsaws or mobile elevating work platforms where people could fall off, presses. It's a list of about 24 different products. So 99.9% of machinery is self-certification, where there's no notified body involvement. But this is also the case with pumps. So the manufacturer is quite right. There's no notified body involvement for pumps. He's allowed to CE mark the product himself and give off a declaration of conformity. And on the declaration, of course, as Leo mentioned, he needs to mention also the local representative, which is located within the European Union. But then there's no further notified body involvement. Whereas if you look at the directive like pressure equipment directive, depending on the category, starting from category 2, you would already have a notified body involvement. So there's a lot more instances with pressure equipment directive that would see involvement of the notified body.
Chris, do we have you back?
Yes, I can hear you, but my screen is frozen. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
can hear
yeah.
you.
Okay, so I all of a sudden lost contact, I believe, but we're of course a long distance from each other. What was when did I drop off?
No, that was about pump, Chris. So as I explained, and you were talking about PD. So as the answer is for that, the manufacturer is right, provided they follow the steps which we have shown during the presentation. Basics of the declaration, describing what kind of motor it is, what's its operationability, having that proper technical file, risk assessment, the harmonized standard mention out there, if any other directive applicable, mention it there, and a proper signed stamp from the local representative as well as the manufacturer.
Correct.
Thank you so much, both of you, Salil and Chris. I know that we've not been able to cover all the questions. So anybody who has an impending question, please, you can write to us. I've already put on the chat our email ID. So please reach out to us and we'll be happy to get back to you. Thank you so much again, Chris, for joining us. So Chris, as Salil mentioned, Chris is a senior consultant with LRQA. He's based in the Netherlands office, and your inputs today were invaluable. Thank you so much again, Chris, for joining us here. And thank you everybody for joining us today, the entire audience. We had a very good number and nobody dropped out. So that just showed how interesting the session was. So thanks again, Salil, and hope you all have an amazing day and amazing evening ahead.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.